This one, we've only got one interpreter for the last two sessions. So this session will go from 2:30 to 3:15, and we will have a short 20-minute break. And then from 3:35 to 4 o'clock, we'll have our last session of the day. So this next session is about the NDIS Quality and Safeguard Commission in Victoria, and I would like to introduce you to the Director of Complaints, Rachel Mathison.
Thanks, Melissa, and thank you everybody for having me here today. As Melissa said, I'm the Director for Complaints here for the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission in Victoria. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is our office here in Victoria and what our functions are, some of the broader functions of the Commission that are undertaken in other parts of the business, and then focus specifically on complaints, how we manage complaints and how they can be lodged and those types of issues. So, the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission is an independent Commonwealth organisation, and the purpose of us being established was to improve the quality and safety of NDIS service delivery. Graham Head is our Commissioner. He's an independent office holder, and he reports directly to the Minister for the NDIS, Stuart Robert. We sit, in terms of government, we sit within the social services portfolio. So what our role is, we regulate the NDIS market, and we took over the registration of NDIS service providers from the NDIA. That's taken effect in all states and territories now, with the exception of WA, and WA come on board into the Commission on the 1st of July 2020. We provide guidance to NDIS service providers and practice information on how they can comply with their responsibilities, including how to provide culturally responsive and appropriate disability services and supports. We regulate all providers who deliver NDIS services, whether they're registered or not, and those providers that are used by both plan and or self-managed participants. So the aim of what we're here to do is to have a look and support a shift in the quality of services that are delivered, the conduct of the NDIS providers, and then support the principles of the NDIS as a whole to ensure that participants are getting choice and control and services delivered in a quality manner. What we deal with is complaints about NDIS service providers. We are different to the NDIA, who deal with issues about plans and plan management, and we deal solely with the service delivery side of things. We look at developing providers by using education and compliance tools, and I'll talk a bit about those later on in the presentation, with the intent of trying to improve the skills and knowledge of the NDIS service providers out there. As I said, from 1 July next year, WA will come on board with us, but until then they're covered by state safeguarding responsibilities, and then the rest of the country is covered by us. So while we regulate providers, what we're looking to do is embed the quality and safeguarding framework into the principles that providers apply when they're delivering all of their services. So two key points in all of that are the human rights. So everything we do obviously is underpinned by the UN Convention on the Rights of a Person with Disabilities. And the framework starts with the presumption that people want to use choice and control in obtaining their services. So that's the key focus of the framework that underpins our work. The other principles about how we work with the providers, so we regulate them in a range of other spaces in addition to what I've just outlined there. So this is the three areas that underpin the work that we do in the Commission. So in the developmental domain, that's where we look at strengthening the capability of providers, as well as people with disability, to ensure that they understand what is out there, how we can assist, and what is required of a service provider and their workers. So that's not necessarily a regulatory function that we provide or that we undertake, but it's there to support the safeguarding and quality frameworks. Measures in the preventative domain, which is the middle one up on the board there, That's intended to prevent the harm and ensure that quality services are delivered to people with disability. That's where a lot of our work in the complaints area fits, and that's what I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on. So the corrective domain is intended to resolve problems, identify improvements, and look at trying to avoid the same problems reoccurring and providing a level of oversight over the system. So if we were to get success in the corrective domain, it means in turn that it becomes a developmental exercise again and the cycle starts over again. So they work together. We expect the providers are working in all of these domains when they're delivering their services and when they're working with us in relation to any of the functions that we have. So we have a number of key functions in the Commission. The first of those is the registration process, and that, as I said earlier, has come over from the NDIA. Unregistered providers are also regulated by us as well. There's the Code of Conduct that applies to unregistered providers, and the Code of Conduct and the Act and the rules apply to those that are registered. We're responsible for compliance and monitoring of compliance activities, investigation, and we have a range of enforcement actions that are open to us under the Act as well. And again, I'll talk about those a bit later on. So we've got complaints, we've got reportable incidents. So where an incident occurs, a provider, as defined by the Act, a provider has an obligation to report to us each incident and take corrective action. And we also have a national oversight of behaviour support, which includes monitoring the use of restrictive practices with the aim to eventually reduce and ultimately eliminate the use of such practices. Each of those functions, with the exception of registration, each of those functions I've described are undertaken here in the Victorian office. And then together in our national office, they also look after the worker screening checks. So from the 1st of July 2020, there'll be a national worker screening process in place that we will manage nationally out of our Penrith head office. We also have a number of information sharing protocols that we have in place between us and other organisations such as the NDIA, other Commonwealth and state-based organisations, people here in Victoria like the Disability Services Commissioner, where we work closely with them to ensure that matters that come to our attention that might fall into their jurisdiction are looked after and transferred so that they're best managed by the best appropriate area. So as I said, here in Victoria, that's just a brief structure of the sections that we have here in Victoria. We have the 5 sections here in Victoria, and then, as I said, registration and the worker screening functions are undertaken in our national office in Penrith. So, in terms of the Code of Conduct, the Code of Conduct sets what the minimum expectations are for a service provider in the NDIS world. It's a clear statement and it's there to empower both consumers and providers in terms of what is expected and what people with disability can expect. So anybody can raise a complaint with us in relation to any concerns that they have about an NDIS provider's potential breach of the Code of Conduct. There's also some coverage in terms of Code of Conduct with programs such as the Continuity of Support program. The local area coordinators are also covered by the NDIS Code of Conduct, so there are a few that are outside of direct service provision that are also covered by the Code of Conduct. We can take a range of actions if we find that a provider or individual worker has breached the Code of Conduct, and we'll go through that a little bit later. And what we're looking to do when we're responding to concerns about the Code of Conduct is primarily to educate and improve the practice of the provider or the worker that's involved in the concern. So we can take corrective action to the point of deregistering NDIS providers so that they can no longer operate in the NDIS market. And there's a range of other civil actions that we can take under that NDIS Act as well. So in terms of obligations on providers, as I said, that chart on the screen gives you a brief outline of where the NDIS Code of Conduct and complaint processes come into it. As you can see up there, the worker screening is optional for unregistered providers, but it's mandatory for registered providers. There are other elements of registration that will determine the other parts of responsibilities in terms of what we look after in our office here. Reportable incident management is something that every registered provider must undertake. Complaints processes must be undertaken by both registered and unregistered providers. So they're the sort of things that we look at each time a complaint has come to us to determine what options are open to us to resolve a concern. Yes?
Hi, I just had a question about the definition of registered providers.
Yes.
If I'm using a service provider and I have a financial intermediary who knows the ABN and that, are they considered, but they haven't registered officially, are they considered to be a registered provider?
No,
Because
they need
they're
a
known?
registered provider, and I'm just about to move on to the provider registration, so this might answer your question. But
Oh, thanks.
yes, that is provider registration. So a provider is considered registered when they register with the NDIS Commission and when they undergo and continue to renew their registration on a registration cycle. So you can use unregistered providers in instances where you're allowed to do that, and it can be any person that you choose to engage.
All right,
Does
thanks.
that?
Yeah, but they're not covered for screening, or they don't have to.
No,
be
so screening is optional for unregistered providers,
Yep.
mandatory for registered providers.
Okay.
But it's up to the individual to choose whether or not they want to engage an unregistered provider who's not part of that national worker screening check.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
So as you can see, there's a range of services that if they are delivered by a provider, the provider must be registered. They cannot choose to remain as an unregistered provider. And it's quite registration is quite a vital process in terms of how we can control what the market is doing and putting the necessary controls on providers. So we expect, whether you're a registered or an unregistered provider, we expect that the delivery of services and supports is in a safe and of a high quality, that NDIS participants' rights are upheld, and that you follow the code of conduct. So to be a registered provider, there are certain things that you have to do. So you have to have a complaint system, you have to meet the new NDIS practice standards, which outline what's required of a provider. You need to make those reportable incidents, and you need to report the use of restrictive practices in the management of behaviour support plans with the aim of reducing and eliminating those practices. So on the 1st of July this year, any provider that was registered with the NDIA automatically became an NDIS registered provider, and they then start the re-registration process with us as a new commission within the first 12 months of operation of the commission here in Victoria. So as I said before, the practice standards set the benchmark for the expectations of a provider. There's a core module that apply to service providers, and then there are some supplementary ones depending upon the nature of the services that you're delivering. All registered providers are either audited or verified or go through a certification process against these practice standards, and that's the registration process that we do in the first 12 months with all of the Victorian providers. South Australia and New South Wales have been in operation for 12 months already, so their providers are already going through the registration process to become a registered NDIS provider under the Commission registration process. When we look at the audit process, it looks at all information held by the Commission in relation to a provider. So complaint information, reportable incident information, anything that's held by our behaviour support teams is all accessible by the auditors for that registration and renewal process. The process itself is proportionate to the size of the business, so there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to the audits, and there's a panel of auditors that have been approved by the Commission that can undertake that work. So the type of audit that is undertaken depends upon the type of business that you run and the type of supports that you provide. There are audit guidelines in place.
I'm just wondering if you have particular measurements against the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities? Particular measurements when auditing or when, for service provision?
Yep.
For the human rights laws?
So all of our work is underpinned by that. In terms of auditing, there's a core set of modules that incorporate all of those values, and the same when we come to complaint management. There's a whole range of things that we take into account when we look at what a complaint issue is, and likewise in the same space with reportable incidents and behaviour support, which is why some of the goals in behaviour support are around reducing and eliminating the use of restrictive practices. Worker screening. As I said, from the 1st of July 2020, there will be a new national scheme in place. It replaces all of the processes that are in place in the state. So as you can imagine, it's quite an effort to align every state and territory to come into one national process, and that's, as I said earlier, being managed out of our national office. A worker who's registered and cleared and is in our database is accessible by all registered NDIS providers and by participants who self-manage. And the scheme, because it is national, means that if there is a worker that's banned or excluded from working in the disability sector in one state, it's accessible by people in every state around the country. There's a range of...
I just wanted to ask, if a non-registered provider wanted to get their worker screened, is that okay through this process?
Yes. Yep.
So they can, even though they're
So for non-registered providers, it's optional.
Mm-hmm.
And the intent obviously is that if you self-manage and use unregistered providers,
Yep.
as your own safeguard, you may want to seek that they're part of that national scheme, so you can opt into that scheme as a provider.
Thank you.
Yep. So, I think I just skipped one. Yes, reportable incidents. As I said earlier, there's a range of incidents that are outlined on that slide where if they occur in the delivery of or in connection with the delivery of NDIS supports and services, then a provider has an obligation to make a report to us. There's also obligations of providers at a state level, and in the national scheme doesn't replace those obligations. So in some instances, providers are having to report some of these events to multiple people. Most instances that fit these categories need to be reported to us within 24 hours of key personnel of that provider becoming aware of the incident. Then there's a more detailed report that can be obtained at the 5-day mark, and a final report at 60 days if that's warranted.
If an incident is reported to you, does that incident get investigated, or is it just from what the provider says?
There's a couple of components. So we need to ensure that there are safeguarding measures in place to reduce the incident reoccurring. So we first require the provider to tell us what it's done to prevent, lessen the harm, stop it occurring, whatever it is, depending upon the nature of the incident. If we're not satisfied with their response, or if we continue to have concerns, then we will ask for more detailed information from them. So we don't actually do the investigations ourselves, we analyse the information that the provider gives us.
So does it not come from the point of view of the participant as well?
So we require that the provider has involved the participant, and that's required under the rules, that the participant is involved in the notification of and the management of.
What if that participant is non-verbal?
We would expect that whoever is their representative is the person that the provider would consult with, as we would in the case where there are complaints. Okay,
so I've had an incident where this has happened, where a provider has called up about a participant and an incident that has occurred at a provider's day service. And they called, but as well as that, the carer called. The incident was reported on both sides. And then after, basically the participant's mother called back to find out what the NDIS was doing about the situation, because she felt her son's voice was not heard and the incident had occurred that she felt was because of communication reasons and the staffing that wasn't appropriate. So I've gone backwards and forwards. So what happened then? It's quite a lengthy thing, but I then came on board because there was no response from the NDIS Quality and Safeguards, and rang directly and spoke to someone, and they said until the meeting is arranged with both parties that you could not help. So we had the meeting, came back from the meeting, I reported what had happened, but I just kept getting back that initial call was the complaint that they would listen to, and that was the only complaint that they were listened to. And what was in that initial complaint from the parent was that she wanted her son to go back with no animosity. So we had a lot more information after that meeting. I asked several times for NDIS to close down and reopen a new complaint, which was completely disregarded, and basically the whole backwards and forwards has been a waste of time. Look, I realise it's only newly rolled out, but I feel there's a lot of issues with your first point of call of complaints. So I would really love to be able to have the opportunity to speak to you further about this if possible.
More than happy to talk to you and talk to you about specifics after this.
Yeah, that would be great.
More than
Thank
happy
you.
to engage with you. So our behaviour support team, they provide best practice and clinical leadership in the space of behaviour support, and in particular around positive behaviour support and the reduction and elimination of the use of restrictive practices. Under the new arrangements, specialist behaviour support can only be provided by an NDIS registered practitioner who's been engaged and is registered with the NDIS Commission. So that's a bit of a change to what people have previously experienced in each of the states. The Positive Behaviour Support Capability Framework outlines the capabilities that we would expect providers to have in order to become registered practitioners within the NDIS space. And there's been a range of processes undertaken to get that to what I think is just about a final version that's almost available on our website in terms of that framework that's available for anybody to use, and obviously particularly behaviour support practitioners. So now, complaints. So the important thing with the complaints world is that anybody can raise a complaint with us. You don't need to be a participant, you don't need to be an advocate, you don't need to be a parent. You can just be somebody who has a concern about the quality of services being delivered to a person with disability who's in receipt of an NDIS delivered service. As I said earlier, each registered provider is expected to and is audited against having an internal complaint mechanism process, and that also includes the availability of that process to us to have a look at and to get involved in, and they also need to make participants aware of the fact that we exist and that participants have the right to come and lodge a complaint with us. It needs to ensure, the providers need to ensure that its system enables complaints to be made easily and to meet the needs of the people that are making the complaints in terms of communication preferences, and that they can do things like lodging complaints anonymously. Part of the auditing process and part of a complaint process that they need to have in order to pass registration requires that they need to keep a record of all of the complaints that they've received. So in terms of what our process involves when people come to us, as I said before, complaints can be made by anybody. They can be made in a manner that's open. So we know who you are, and we tell the provider who you are and who the participant is. They can be anonymous, where you ring us up once, provide us with information, you're not involved in the resolution process from there on out, and we resolve that issue with the provider. Or it can be confidential, where your information or the participant's information is withheld from the provider. We know who you are and we communicate with you, but we don't divulge your information to the provider. When we're looking at complaints, we can look at a range of information from the provider. We'll look at things like their complaint management system. We can request copies of progress notes, communication diaries, medical records, staffing rosters, evidence of staff training, whatever it is that we believe is appropriate to address the concerns that have been raised with us. Part of that process also involves us looking at policies and procedures that a provider has in place to ensure that they're in place to minimise the risk of complaints being raised again. So there's a
Question? Thank you. I think it's related. I'm interested in the providers, and I'm interested in the standard staffing and salary costs and levels. Is it standard across all tiers of salary, or is it
within a provider?
Yes.
That's a business decision for each provider to make as to how they manage their staff.
So there's no sort of consistent, if you are at this.
No. That's a business decision. We don't get involved in that side of a business process that a provider might choose to undertake.
Just another question.
Sure.
I need a microphone. Sorry, I'll use this microphone, actually. So I was just wondering how many complaints you've received over this time, and also interested to know how many complaints were upheld, or do you have any statistics or numbers that you can give us related to that?
I don't have any statistics on me today, but I'm more than happy to send through some information to Melissa separately that she can distribute to you. I guess the one comment I would make is anecdotally, we haven't received as many complaints in Victoria as we expected we might in our first few months of operation. Not sure why that is. Getting out to forums like this is certainly one of the things we can do to help improve the numbers of complaints that we receive. The more we get out there and let people know who we are, hopefully the more confidence people will have in coming to us to help them with their concerns. So there are a range of things that we can take complaints about. Essentially, it's anything to do with the quality and service delivery that an NDIS provider has provided or hasn't provided and should have provided. As long as the services have been delivered and paid for out of an NDIS plan, it falls within our jurisdiction. The one qualifier for that is we can't look at things that occurred prior to the 1st of July this year. Our jurisdiction started on the 1st of July this year, and for events that occurred prior to that, the Disability Services Commissioner is the body that still looks after those complaints. As I said earlier, the one thing that we do receive a lot of calls about is about NDIA plans and issues with plans and plan reviews and questions about why a plan has something in it that when it was, meant to have something else in it. So all of those actions that are taken by the NDIA are still dealt with by the NDIA. If there are services that are delivered that are not through an NDIS provider, we obviously don't have jurisdiction for those. And also any decisions that are made in courts. So particularly where there might be issues around guardianship, we can't get involved in the guardianship decisions, but we can consider the situation and the role of a guardian in dealing with a complaint. One of the, the messages that we do want to get out there is that we have a no wrong door policy. If somebody comes to us with a complaint about one of these other organisations, we will take the complaint details off you and we will make a warm referral to the right organisation. We do that with the consent of the caller. We also offer the caller the opportunity to make that referral themselves and provide them with the correct information so that they can approach that other organisation directly themselves if that's what they want to do. But part of those information sharing processes that I spoke about earlier involve the warm referral of complaints so that you don't have to tell your story to multiple people. We can take all of the information and forward that on to whomever is the appropriate body. So as I said before, anybody can raise a complaint about the provision of services. You don't need to be the recipient of those services in order to lodge a complaint with us. We have, I guess, a range of people that we have had complaints from so far. We have participants who ring up themselves. We have carers for participants. We have had anonymous complaints come in as well. Most of those have come in via the web form. But we've had them from a range of different people. We do encourage people to talk to their provider first before coming to us. A lot of the complaints that we are receiving are where people have already done that and they've not received a satisfactory answer from the provider. And so what then forms part of the complaint issue, in addition to the quality of service issue that they're bringing to us, is a complaint about the complaint management system of the provider. So nearly all of our complaints will have an element of complaint management in them at this point in time. As I spoke about earlier, our educative focus is to get providers to improve those practices so that if people are comfortable in using a provider's complaint processes, those processes will enable them to achieve a resolution without involving us unless it's necessary. So, could I just get the microphone at the front of the room, please, for a question?
How long after making the initial complaint with the provider before we should be contacting you?
I guess it depends upon the nature of the complaint that you're making. Good complaint handling practices would be that the provider would tell you when you can expect to get a response, and if by that stage you haven't got a response, we would encourage you to go back to the provider, but you don't have to do that multiple times. But it would be preferable to give the provider an opportunity to respond to the concerns that you've raised with them, and then if they're just not responding, or if they're responding but not actually resolving your concern, that information can then come to us at that point. Having said that, as I said, if you're not comfortable, if there are issues that have led to a communication breakdown or a relationship breakdown, then you don't have to attempt that, but we would encourage it, particularly where there's an ongoing relationship. We would encourage you to give the opportunity to the provider to resolve it before it comes to us.
Thank you.
So, as I said earlier, we've kind of got this cycle of how we deal with complaints and what we do. We attempt to resolve the complaints as informally and as quickly as we possibly can. What that involves is a lot of back and forth over the telephone between us and a provider and a complainant and the participant if the complainant is not the participant. And we'll sort of transfer information between the parties in an attempt to get a resolution. We also have some more formal resolution approaches that we can take. One of those includes conciliation, where we can ask a provider and a participant or the complainant to sit in a room with us and facilitate a discussion in an attempt to get a resolution to the process. There's obviously then cases that can't be resolved. Despite what we do, the provider may not satisfy us that it's met its responsibilities, in addition to not satisfying the complainant of the resolution of the approach. So that's when we then move into our compliance framework. That triangle on the board gives you an indication of the sort of lower level stuff at the bottom where the bulk of our compliance and preventative action is undertaken, all the way through to the top, which is to do with banning orders. So where providers or individuals have breached their responsibilities and have not taken action to improve them, or where they've breached their responsibilities where there might be issues such as criminal charges that have been laid against workers, that's the sort of cases that make it to the pointy end of that triangle, which is the banning orders that are put in place. Got a question at the back of the room?
Thanks ever so much. Can you give us an idea about how many of those at that highest level have actually got through the system?
I can't tell you the number, but what I can tell you is that it's available publicly on our website. We have a list of all banned workers and providers on our website, and that information is made publicly available for anybody to search and to have a look at. So there have been no banning orders made in Victoria yet. We're only 5 months old, so we haven't got to that point yet. But South Australia...
What about the revocation of the registration?
Yep, so that is just starting now. That cycle takes 12 months, and South Australia and New South Wales are just at the sort of midpoint of their 12-month renewal process. So all of that is underway, but the banning orders take place separately to registration decisions, and that's publicly available for anybody to see on our website.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Patrick McGee from the Australian Federation of Disability Organisations. 2 questions. Given that most complaints will actually come via an advocate, probably, how will the Commission work with advocates to streamline the process so that a complainant doesn't have to continually tell their story throughout the process? That's the first question. And then the second question would be, given that this is very much a white, Anglo model, complaint-driven, how will the Commission tailor what it does to make it culturally safe for Indigenous Australians to also participate in the complaint process?
Okay, so the first part of your question in terms of how we involve advocates in our process.
Well, just because the complaints are likely to get generated out of conversations with advocates. That's the first point of call.
So I guess anecdotally, the majority of our complaints have not come from advocates to date.
Well, that's then a problem, isn't it?
Yep,
because in fact, what we know is that it's individual advocates who people have the trust relationship with, on the ground in the local area. So if you're not seeing advocates call you up, wouldn't you say that that's a problem?
So we are working, as earlier I mentioned, that these forums like these are what we're doing to get ourselves out there to introduce ourselves to advocates. We're working closely with a number of advocacy groups and bodies and peak bodies. We're working on and are not too far off, hopefully, putting out some further information about exactly how we will work with advocates. There are a number of considerations that we need to take when we deal with advocates in terms of privacy. So we have some work being done around consent and sharing of personal information and all of that sort of stuff in the space of advocates. But if you read our rules and principles, we actually have a higher I guess there's a higher impost on us to ensure that where advocates are involved or need to be involved, that we get advocates involved. So we are working, and we would work with an...
It's not going to come that way, it's going to come the other way around. It's going to come from advocates.
Yep, so we will work directly with the complainant, whether they're an advocate, whether they're the participant, whomever it is, we'll work directly with that person to get a resolution. And now I've forgotten what your second question was. All right, so yes, so we are working on that, and we have some strategies towards working with people from a range of different cultures, not just the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander.
And I'm talking about our First Nations people specifically, not Gold. I want you to talk to that because First Nations is different to Gold, and what we need is culturally safe pathways for Indigenous Australians with disabilities to make complaints.
So we are working, we are working with Indigenous peak bodies to look at what we can do to help. We are only 5 months old, and we are still learning who our key stakeholders are in that space, and we are establishing relationships with them and working with them to see how we can better improve our service. I know that's not a specific answer, and you're probably wanting something quite specific.
Not specific at all, really, is it? And it says to me that you're not actually ready and culturally safe for Indigenous Australians to be complaining to you.
I don't know that I would agree with that statement, but
you can't give me a specific...
Where we have people come to us with needs, regardless of whether they are first...
No, but they're not going to come to you, are they?
Yeah.
If it's not culturally safe.
We are working with the peak bodies to develop some strategies as to how we can get out there to...
Giving you a hard enough time.
Thank you. The lady behind you had a question, though.
Hi, I just wanted to know what kind of education support programs you have. I know you mentioned a couple of modules, but just wanting to know what kind of education
Yeah, so
you're offering?
we don't actually have any formal processes because we're responding to requests at the moment. So whether it's an education session like this, whether it's going out and talking to working groups who specialise in particular parts of the sector, our behaviour support team are working together with a number of peak bodies to talk to providers and educate providers in the behaviour support space. Our compliance guys are doing proactive education, so either off the back of referrals that we would make from complaints or from the reportable incident space. They will go out and proactively work with providers one-on-one and do some educative work in that space. So we're really at the moment tailoring it to what the market is telling us it needs or is asking of us to deliver in that education space.
Okay.
Excuse me, everyone. As I mentioned before we started, we only have a few minutes left before we have to take a break for the interpreter. So can you please hold off your question, let her finish, and then we'll take a break before we start the next session. You can ask questions in the break. Thank you.
So I am just about finished. This is about the second last slide, so I've done it in good timing. As I said, the banning orders and the information on banning orders is all available on our website, and that's publicly accessible by anybody who wants to have a look at it. We have a range of other measures that we can take as well, including civil penalties and notices, infringement notices that can be issued to providers, and we're working through that range of tools now. And as I said, most of those actions to date have been taking place in South Australia and New South Wales because they're a more established jurisdiction than what here in Victoria is. As I said, our website has a whole range of information that's constantly being updated. There's also a range of information packs that are available to download from the website. You can find out what it is that we tell providers and the education kits that we provide to providers as much as you can find out the information that we have available for participants as well. So that was the end of my presentation.
Sorry guys, we can't do questions right now, but I'm sure that Rachel will take questions through the break. So we need to have a break for 20 minutes, and then the next presentation will happen at 3:35. So if you want to see Rachel, feel free.
Yep,
Thank you.
please do.